So I'm reading these critics and I'm saying, did they want us to already dislike the movie because they don't like the director? They don't like the writer. So I'm going in there, radar ready, call out how black artists are going to be misrepresented, the stereotypes. And the movie, far from perfect. That's for sure. But I got to tell you, as a time at the movies, I'm sitting there, 3 hours went by mighty fast. It's remarkably moving in its own way. And Austin Butler, who plays Elvis, that man's a star. I said, a star is born. And at the end of it, I cried at the end. I couldn't believe it.
I have a unique perspective on that film in that I think a lot of the criticisms, most of them being, it did this or it didn't do that, I think they're all correct. But I think all of the praise is correct, too. It's the weirdest movie I've ever seen in that I can see a lot of what people are complaining about, but I just don't think it matters.
I could go down the list of things that were wrong chronologically. I could say an obvious one would be Tutti Frutti. I was like, Tutti Frutti was already a hit before any of this happened. Exaggerating some of the relationships he had with black musicians. But I find Elvis so fascinating as a cultural figure precisely because as a white Negro trickster, what he represented, good and bad. And this movie is a weird thing. I've seen it twice now. It is so much bigger than the sum of its parts. And I'm sitting there trying to take it apart. And I said, I can make a list. The way that the director chose to depict Elvis's relationship with the black artist, almost especially at the juke joint in the church, like these sweaty black bodies. And that's an old stereotype, black sexuality. And he's this white kid sitting there. But then I said, well, if you buy the conceit of the film, and I'm very interested in what you made of this as a storyteller, that it's a story told from the point of view of the colonel. So it's going to be distorted. It's going to be flat. It's going to be exaggerated through his lens. And I said, if you buy that pastiche, that convention, I damn near say, not that it's an excuse for a lot of the choices he made, but the movie coheres differently. Because Elvis doesn't really have a lot of agency in the movie because it's from the colonel's point of view. So I'm watching it saying it as a surreal depiction, good and bad, of Elvis as a cultural figure, even though I felt like the black figures were almost, because he's a superhero. And I love what they did with him in Shazam, Captain Marvel, how he thought of himself as a superhero and he's getting the power from black folks. Politically, that's very problematic. I can explain it, the black culture industry. But if you look at Elvis as like an archetype, this mythic figure, it's the damnedest movie in that way.
You have to look at black culture, but you also have to look at white culture and its perspective, both positive and negative, and see that it plays with all of that stuff. And you also get to bring two people, and I had younger people with us. There was a whole row of us. We went, and they didn't know who Sister Rosetta Tharpe was, or Big Mama Thornton, or any of those people, but now they do. Elvis borrowed, Hound Dog from here. He borrowed this from there, but he brought his own style too. I'm not one of those that believes that music belongs to anybody because I think we're always stealing. When the Irish brought their music over, it became mountain music or country music. And then when black people listened to it and they put rhythm and blues to it, it changed the music. And then when Elvis came along,
hell, the guitar and the drum are African instruments.
That's right. He borrowed it, but yet he changed it. His voice is so goddamn unique that once, especially after it had ripened, nobody sounds like that guy. And he's always been my favorite singer. I mean, I love him. And of course, Little Richard can't be matched. Chuck Berry always played the guitar weird, had a weird way of doing it. But God, what a performer, what a songwriter. Yeah, and what he wanted to do was be a country singer. And you take Ray Charles, he started out being a country singer. And when you'd heard them, if you could have heard them on the radio, then you'd have gone, it never occurred to you that they were black people singing white music. In the same way, it didn't occur to people that Elvis was a white man singing black music. So I think instead of looking at differences so much, it's just to look at how we can find where we're more alike. I watched that movie and I thought, you know what? This is going to bear the fact that people like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, she was playing that damn guitar like these rock stars before there were rock stars. I mean, she was so far ahead of everybody. Strange Things Every Day. If you listen to that and listen to the way she plays that electric guitar, holy moly.
As a storyteller, someone, we'll talk Bubba Ho-Tep, Hap, everything, we just get going, we get started. But to the Elvis, I was thinking about you, someone who's the fiction writing, the experience film and TV. And again, this is why I think there's a whole business as we know of critics. Some movies are going to get positively reviewed and some are just going to get panned. And a lot of that is politics. I don't know the background of Baz Luhrmann. in Hollywood. I've heard mixed things. I think a lot of the hate is just against him in general. But as someone who knows this world and is a master storyteller, again, going back to judging the film, the movie, based on its premises, what it was trying to accomplish, to your eye, what was Baz Luhrmann trying to do? And did he accomplish it? Because I think that's the fair way to judge what he created.
In a funny way, you also say that movie, the main star in that was him, the director, because it was the way he put it together. And I think it goes back to that. It was Roger Ebert. And I think he was talking about one of these guys' movie. Maybe he did Moulin Rouge. He said it was like being trapped in an elevator with a circus. And in some ways, the Elvis movie's like that. And I didn't know if I liked it the first 15 minutes. I thought, damn, give me time to breathe. He had so much ground to cover. You know, he did it from birth to death and all the little avenues in between. Many of them. He didn't cover the martial arts because Elvis was a fantastic fan of martial arts.
Also left out all the stuff with Nixon, too.
Yeah.
And how conservative Elvis was in that way.
In martial arts, I mean, one of my friends who's in his 90s now is Chuck Sullivan, was a sparring partner back when Elvis was starting out and training with Ed Parker, because Chuck was Ed Parker's fourth black belt. There were some things like that missing, but what I thought is that in this time, and it was a long movie, he had to capture a lot of stuff. And I think his idea was to make it surrealistic and maybe impressionistic at times, a combination of methods. I felt like it felt like what you felt when you first discovered Elvis. And that was that feeling of phantasmagoric. Oh my God, the world's not in black and white after all. I thought it was in black and white. What is this? What is it? What am I hearing? What is this voice? And then when you see him, you go, oh my God, this guy, what is he? He looks like a Greek god. And then the dancing and stuff and all of that stuff that was new at that time. And the way the girls were going nuts, you go, whoa, what is the deal? All of that, I think, was captured in the film. That it was like an electrified memory. It was like everything you'd ever known or read about Elvis or was a fan of Elvis. It was all put to electricity and cranked to the max. It's like all these things run through your head. And then later when the movie's over, it starts to settle. And the movie, for me, just gets better and better and better. And I'm one of the few people that liked his Great Gatsby better than any other version, because I think there was a similarity involved there in that every time they try to make an adaptation of the Great Gatsby of Fitzgerald's work, they get what makes his work is his prose. And what this guy did was that he electrified that story in such a way that I actually felt it was closer to the novel than those that had been absolutely trying to make it just day to day. That doesn't work because it's the prose in that Fitzgerald had, and it felt like prose in that movie he did. I actually was bothered by the more modern music that was used there, and in the same way with Elton, they dipped into it. It pulled me out of the era.
I didn't like that either. I felt it was unnecessary. It was a hat on top of a hat on top of a hat, you know? But going to the point when we see Elvis in that surreality, the choice aesthetically, when we see him at dancing, right, opening it up, and all the women, all these white women, girls, teenagers, are swooning, basically having orgasms. And he focuses in on Elvis's knees and his crotch. He might as well just put a light on his crotch. You were there. Was Elvis, because I've read about it, but I wasn't there, did he exude that type of raw sex appeal? Like white man singing black, shaking his hips, and women having orgasms? Because you're watching it and you're like, damn.
The thing is that guy, as good as he was as an actor, he's not Elvis. And the thing about Elvis and Priscilla, this is one of the things that's very rare, is the people who portrayed him weren't as pretty as the original people, the real people. And it's usually the other way around. But Elvis, he looked like a Greek god. And when you see him in that 1968 special, you just go, my God, this guy isn't human. Skin is perfect, everything. And then he's got that voice. You know, he's already got a history then. So yes, they did. I remember thinking, wow, what is that? What's going on? Because, I was a little kid. I didn't really understand that, but I knew something was going on because I could feel this energy. So it wasn't entirely just women, and it wasn't entirely just sexual too, although that's certainly a large part of it. I think there was an energy and a power and a charisma, like you had reached into something and had touched another universe where everybody there was more powerful than you. And I just remember when I heard him, I just thought, whoa. People now, they've been hearing him all their life in fucking elevators. But back then, there was nothing like that. There was nothing like that. And he was so powerful sexually that they tried to burn his records, had him arrested. Churches were going crazy. And all they did was just make people go, maybe I should check this out.
A lot of critics didn't like this. They tell it from the point of view of the Colonel. And there are some choices here with Tom Hanks as the actor. He can do anything, but that nose was distracting. I don't know what the hell was going on there. Some folks have said Baz Luhrmann is anti-Semitic. No, I just think it was bad makeup. But that having been said, don't attribute to malice what could just be a bad choice.
I thought that was the Colonel. What I do agree with, at first I thought, oh my God, I don't want to see this from his point of view. But, he didn't always stay in his point of view. Now, although a lot of people think he did, when you really think about the film, it got completely out of his point of view. But it would come back to him like he was the devil. Tom Hanks played him like he was Satan. And he would just sort of show up, or he'd be sitting there with his cane and that look like he just came up from hell. And he's constantly giving you're selling your soul idea. I don't think the Colonel was as bad as they presented him. He was not a wonderful human being by any means. But one thing they didn't show was that back when Elvis was in Vegas, he made sure they wanted to sell the tickets for like 2 and 3 times what they were sold for. And he didn't want to do that because he said, look, Elvis, a lot of his fans are blue collar, common people. They can't afford it. And so let's make it where it's affordable. And I think that in many ways, he honestly thought he was handling his career well. And when you really think about it, Elvis wasn't working any more than any other musician of that era. They were all worked 200, 300 times days a year. What was the problem was once he got so hooked on the medicine, which is what he thought of it as. Of course, it was just drugs. But after that happened, that's what was destroying him. And the fact he couldn't accept or believe that he had a real problem. But I think the Colonel was an ass. And I do think that he was a manipulator. And I think that he hurt Elvis's career as much as he helped it. But I think the first 10 years of Elvis's career, or certainly the early years of Elvis's career, would never have been there without the Colonel. But about the time he got out of the Army, that's when he should have fired him and moved on to other things. I did think it was an interesting choice, and I came to sort of think that it was merely this pose of this guy being the Satan that kept putting Elvis out there so he could get this love from this audience that they kept talking about. And I really think that was true. I think Performer has that addiction too. And he was an addictive guy, that there was a kind of old style father-son, also ownership thing going. I think it was a complex relationship.
I would start with the author's intent. Musician, what did they try to accomplish? Okay, if you accept the conceit that this is from this point of view, it's a fan film, it's not an accurate biopic, it's the best of, it's certain choices. You got Tom Hanks being the Colonel. And, I'm fascinated by carny culture, professional wrestling, subcultures. I love the introduction of the Colonel, the snowman, and how he's snowing, and that he's working the con and the marks. And a lot of critics, I don't know, Elvis doesn't have enough agency. Well, maybe from this point of view, from the Colonel, he is just an object, a means to an end. And I thought that was very effective.
I think that's exactly right. The Colonel looked at him and, the way some men look at women, I own you and you're going to do what I want and you're going to be what I want you to be. That was going on. I do think the Colonel for real had that. Like I said, I think this is the extreme. Everything in that film is the extreme. It really is like a fever dream. It's like thinking of all this stuff that's real and yet thinking of all this stuff that isn't real simultaneously. It's almost like Elvis is having a fever dream at the end of his life and everything just collides,
You were there. You made Bubba Ho-Tep and all this other good stuff. You thought deeply about Elvis. Was he a tragic figure? How much agency did he have in his story?
The real Elvis was powerful from the standpoint of a performer, and he was extremely well liked by people. And he was a very honest, kind person. He was always buying people Cadillacs. It was one of the reasons he was broke. It wasn't just that,
So that's real.
Yeah, that's real.
That's not part of the myth.
Yeah, that wasn't just the Colonel was taking his money. Elvis was, he liked to spend money, and he did spend money, and he spent money on people he didn't even know. And he gave to all kinds of charities that they didn't even know. He was involved with black performers, but he never took credit. Back then, that was considered gauche, especially if you were from the South and you were somebody that was trying to be gracious, modest, whatever. And I'm sure segregation affected it too. I'm sure he thought, well, I don't want to get too much out front of this because it could hurt my career. And I'm sure that was part of it. But I think too is when Elvis first came along, he was hated by a large number of people because there was just nobody like him performing. He was nervous and he would dance and move around. Also, that was very much of like the holiness church and the churches that he grew up in. You were feeling the spirit. And when he sang, he felt the spirit. And even though I'm not religious, I think that the spirit he felt transferred itself to the people. So I know saw him on television and in movies. I never saw him in person. But if you see certain things, you see that 1968 special, or you just see him doing something kind of one of those silly films like Bossa Nova Baby, and you go, there's something else in this guy. Viva Las Vegas with Ann Margaret, who was kind of like the female Elvis at that time. You see them together, you go, this ain't natural. This is something that it just is. This person, everything, all the genetics, talent, and actually the way he grew up all came together to create this powerful being. And I don't know how many people I've heard say when he walked into a room, there wasn't anybody else.
What is his intangible that we respond to, that people still respond to this day?
It's intangible. That's the answer. We don't really know. I think you can add sincerity to that more than anything else. I think it was sincerity and the fact that, and it was played in the movie, that he really wanted that love from his audience. I think he was grateful that he had come from nothing. And, I can't relate to it in the way, of course, Elvis, but as a poor boy and a poor Southern boy, just my career and how happy I've been with it, I'm just grateful. And you can imagine somebody that had the tremendous social, musical impact that he had. Man, he was grateful. I think that's so good because many of them aren't. They aren't grateful. I think that sincerity is something that reached out to people. And I think that's part of what charisma is.
What was your take on Austin Butler's performance as Elvis? He nails it. Now, he was not at the level of Jamie Foxx's Ray. What did you think about Austin Butler? What did he get right or wrong?
He was a little bit like Ricky Nelson playing Elvis Presley, but he was fantastic. Don't get me wrong. I just think there's some people, you're not going to do Ray Charles. You can do a really good version. Jamie Foxx did a really good version, but Ray Charles is Ray Charles. And Elvis is Elvis. It's like Johnny Cash. I love that movie. And his son and I know each other. And my daughter, Casey, actually, he produced a couple of her albums. He's a great guy, too. And you can see all of these things and all of their background coming from their parents and everything. And you realize that there's just something unique about those people in their desire for success and to perform. And I thought Austin really, he got that. I think his middle-aged Elvis and his later Elvis were better than his young Elvis. But I thought the young Elvis stuff was more exciting.
What was it like in that moment towards the end of his life?
It was very strange. You'd never seen Elvis that way, and you didn't know what was going on until later. I think a lot of it was the drugs and steroids that made him paranoid. Also, a lot of the swelling wasn't just eating peanut butter and banana sandwiches. It was because he was affected by the drug, but we didn't know that's what was going on. So all we could see was, wow, he's not really taking care of himself and he's really eating insanely and all that. What a lot of people don't get is he was only that way for 2 or 3 years, if it was that long, because he got that way quick and then he was gone, And even then, when you heard him, he still had it. He still had that voice. And I think when you saw women, they were still nuts for him because what they saw is the Elvis they wanted to see when they heard him sing.
And the other thing there, too, about fame and stardom and celebrities, and people leave out, it's obvious, we age with our idols. So when they're looking at Elvis, his 40-year career, they're imagining themselves as 18 again or 20 again, right? So when they see Elvis, they see young Elvis, just like when they're with him, they feel like they're alive again. And again, going back to what the movie captured, it's not a biopic. It's a surreal depiction of a life. And if you judge it on those terms, it's remarkably successful.
It's falsely accurate.
There you go. Yeah, it's a true lie. It's falsely accurate.
He didn't know B.B. King, but, they were acquaintances, and B.B. really liked him. He had nothing but great stuff to say about him. And, he said that Elvis treated him like a man. And he said he always called me sir. And he said, I appreciated that. But when you were growing up in the South, especially in that era, you didn't call black people sir. That wasn't something you were supposed to do. I did because, I would have been taught, yes, ma'am, sir, things that people make fun of now, I actually think were wonderful because they were signs of respect. And black people just didn't get called sir by white people much. You had to be pretty prominent. And even then, you didn't want to ride in a car with a black person then and let somebody see you that was white. You might have them in the back seat. They would get the idea, oh, you're taking them somewhere to work. That's how bad it was.
As you said, he traveled in these circles. He drew on black music. But the way they depicted him as sort of like super white liberal with the stuff about Dr. King that likely did not occur. He had this complicated relationship with black people as human beings and black music.
There's a documentary on Elvis where it talks about that. And he said he always told the truth. And that was in the film. That was not made up if the documentary's correct. But supposedly he did say that. And even though he was not what we think of as a liberal now, in fact, he was a conservative.
I mean, publicly, some type of racial liberal.
I think he probably was. I think at least from the standpoint that he thought everybody was pretty much the same, but his politics were more conservative. But that tended to be because he grew up in the South and politics were more conservative. But politics and the person aren't always the same.
And I'm surprised they didn't bring up what Elvis and his black backup singers in Texas and some of these other Jim Crow places. I was waiting for that. I know we got 2 hours and 40 minutes. That's sort of a big deal. When Elvis said, no, my black backup singers are coming with me, or I'm not doing the stadium show. Or I also thought, going back to Wishes, there was an article. Remember that Sepia was in a black magazine that was competing with Ebony. It was called Sepia. And they had a journalist who made up that story about Elvis being racist. I thought that would have been a powerful moment where Elvis, invented or not, hears about that and is hurt or angry.
A lot of the people who knew him said, no, he wasn't racist. He wasn't getting out in front and waving the flag like might have been helpful. And but he did a lot of it behind the scenes, and he did a lot of kind things. He was a human of his era. But I think that whole thing about him being racist is absolutely wrong. I think it's because people think he made success with black music, and they don't like that. And I think that black music deserved a greater awareness than it had. But nonetheless, I think that without him, it might still be race record. And I think that he had a lot to do with breaking down segregation because his music was across the board. And again, people like me that didn't really know about black music as a child, suddenly I did. Suddenly knew who a lot of people were that I had never heard of that had been around forever and had influenced the music. That was the door being opened. And you're looking and going, okay, here it is.
But if there were one or two things about Elvis you wish they had included, what would it have been? Something you were like, oh, I wish they had.
The martial arts, because I'm a martial artist and I know some of the people that knew him, were involved in martial arts with him. And I would have liked to seen more about that. I would have liked to seen more about the relationship he had with his mother. They skimmed over the fact that Priscilla was 14 when they first met. Excuse us for this. That wasn't uncommon in the South. Jerry Lee Lewis married his cousin. She was 13. And that kind of screwed his career overseas. But a lot of people in certain areas then, and really up until relatively recent times in certain areas of the South, that wasn't considered weird.
How good a martial, and using that word good in quotation marks, how skilled a martial artist was Elvis? Because you're a very serious martial artist. I mean, the people who trained him. How good was he?
I remember Chuck Sullivan, I asked him about that because he was his sparring partner. He said, well, he held his own and he said he was tough. What he told me, he said that Ed Parker said, see what he's made out of. And he said he was made out of good stuff. Was he a great martial artist? No. Was he a black belt? Yes. Was he the greatest black belt? And was he like the 7th or 8th degree black belt he claimed to be? No. Ed Parker looking at it and saying, this is a way to promote martial arts by having this guy, probably the best known person in the world at that time, or one of the best known people in the world, to be taking this art and to be taking the martial arts. So I think he saw it as somewhat as propaganda. From what I have heard from people is he was a solid black belt. Now, was he any more than that? That probably not.
Because he's a figure, he's a symbol, he's a man, he's a myth. How is this version of Elvis different from your Elvis and Bubba Ho-Tep? Or the same?
I think my Elvis, actually, even though mine was fantastic too in its own way, obviously, I think it was closer in some ways to the things that what little I knew about Elvis and the things that I had learned about Elvis through reading, some of them accurate, some of them maybe not, because when you're telling a story like that, just like him, you're creating your own mythology. But I do believe that at Elvis, when he got to a certain age, he felt that he had missed out, that he had all these opportunities, primarily in film, because he'd already done all this stuff in music. And I think he thought that was all a flash in the pan anyway, and that he had to move into film to stay relevant. And in the 60s, he was kind of in a wasteland, but from the middle 60s on till the late 60s, 68 special, he was kind of in a wasteland there. I'm sure that was all a very confusing era for him because he had, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and James Brown and all these different people are coming along, and it's just different. And I'm sure he didn't know exactly what to do with it. So he thought, well, maybe I can push the movies and keep, as I go on, get into better movies after a handful of these crummy movies, but he couldn't get off the wheel. And I think part of that was the Colonel, but I think part of it was Elvis. I think he liked easy money. I think he liked hanging with his friends. I think that having the Memphis Mafia, as they were called, around was important to him. So I think he's as responsible for his lack of career as anybody, because ultimately you make those choices. You decide to do those. He could have fired the Colonel at any time. And as powerful as he was, he won that deal. He would have come out just fine. He could have gone overseas and made millions. And I think it was a combination of feeling like he owed the Colonel and that old Southern loyalty that was sometimes blind loyalty mixed in with the fact that he was obviously, I think, in spite of everything, somewhat insecure. And he was shy. And I think all of those things worked for him and against him. When you would see interviews with him, some people said he wasn't that great in the interview, but he actually was by doing very little. He was very polite. He was very likable, very personable. He didn't seem like the devil in the interviews. He was the devil when you put him on stage.
I like that. And where were you? Because again, you had the very famous Village Voice article where they talked to folk in New York about where they were when Elvis died, the day that Elvis died. And of course, most of the people the writer spoke to were utterly dismissive and indifferent. It would have cared more about, Donna Summers in disco, if somebody in disco died. So it's a snapshot of that moment in New York. But where were you when he died? And what was it like that day?
I was working as a janitor at the university here, Stephen F. Austin, and a friend that was a janitor with me, we had a night shift. It was just the two of us doing this particular building, and we cleaned it at night and did all that. And he came in, he said, Elvis died. And we both just were, it was like losing a family member. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. I really felt like I was going to cry. And probably had he not been there, I would have. I know I did later. Because it hurt me deeply, because here was a guy that had formed my interest in music. Here was a guy who had introduced me directly or indirectly to all kinds of music I didn't know existed. Here was a guy whose image and coolness were something that we all were aspiring to, even if we weren't copying him necessarily. We wanted to be cool like Elvis. I remember when I was younger and I wanted to have hair like Elvis, Later I had hair down to my waist, but nonetheless, we all at some point were imprinted with Elvis. And we were, even somebody like John Wayne, whose politics were absolutely 100% on the other side of mine, when he died, that was painful because I grew up on his movies, not his politics. Those people form a lot of who we are. And, when they die, it takes something away from you. When John Lennon was killed, I didn't know, I felt pain that I still feel. And John Kennedy, when he was killed, and when Martin Luther King was killed, and when Bobby Kennedy was killed, those things struck places in me I didn't even know I had. And I still feel them. Sometimes it's just because, like in Wayne's case, they've just been with you all your life. I mean, he'd been in movies for years before I was born. Those people were imprinting things on you. Sometimes they were teaching you things. Sometimes they were just teaching you how to handle yourself in the sense of how you were going to walk, how you were going to talk. Maybe you didn't agree with what their politics were because you didn't know them. I didn't know Elvis's politics and know much about him until much later in his life, mainly after his death. Nobody really knew anything about Elvis till after his death, because he kept it all in. And his belief was, I'm a performer. I'm not going to give anybody on either side anything to bite into, because I don't want that to distract from the fact that I'm a performer.
I got to ask Champion Joe, what's going on with Hap and Leonard? Where are my new Hap and Leonard stories?
Well, there's a new collection out of Hap and Leonard stories called Born for Trouble, and that's out right now. And doing pretty good from Tachyon. I do all my novels with Little Brown Mulholland, but I do short story collections with other publishers. So that's the Hap and Leonard's out now. I have 2 other books and a memoir that I'm supposed to write. And after that, I'm probably going to go back to Hap and Leonard for.
So I got to wait another year, 2 years, 3? When am I going to see my friends?
Maybe like 3. Well, you get Born for Trouble, you'll get to see them. Speaking of that, I've got to say this. Michael K. Williams, what a loss. What a terrible, terrible loss.
We got to honor the memory, because I was going to ask if you brought it up. Did you ever, because I think I emailed you, did you ever really get to meet him? What was he like if you got to meet him? What was he like?
Yeah, I was only one that sat with him for about whatever time it took for them to do the first season, which seemed like it was about 2 months. You know, there was preparatory stuff and things like that. And I would see him almost every day. James and I were a little better friends because he was actually a British version of a country boy. But Mike was funny. He was sweet. He was open about his problems with drugs that he had and I guess was still having. He was a kind person, you know, and I liked him. He had a little bit of standoffishness that was kind of hidden underneath all that because I think that, you know, I think a lot of people wanted to know Michael because he's that kind of guy. He's a cool guy. He was a special person. I think what people don't know from the parts he played is he wasn't like any of those parts. He was a very sweet, kind person, gentle. That doesn't mean he might not have a mean or dark side if it came up, but I was always impressed with his humanity and the fact that he did all kinds of charitable work and things like that that you didn't hear as much about as you could have.
That was some good TV. That was some damn good TV. That was some damn good TV.
It was some good TV. I liked it a lot. And it was their most popular show. It wasn't canceled because it wasn't popular. It canceled because they had somebody else come in that was running Sundance and he had a different vision. And that happens all the time. I think that in 6 months he was gone after he was there too. So, you know, then somebody else was going to have another vision. But it's on Netflix and it's still rocking on Netflix. And in fact, on Father's Day in Parade magazine, it was listed as one of those TV series, one of the best that people need to see and check out on Netflix. So I thought that